Here, it could play a more active role. You're saying
it's realpolitik. From the Iranians' point of view, they wanted freedom on the nuclear dossier.
The West ignored the offer of a deal, but Iran had made it clear. If it were attacked, its allies in Iraq would kill more Americans, British and Iraqis there. President Ahmadinejad announced that Iran would restart its nuclear enrichment plant.
اونها از سلاح هسته‌ای نمی‌ترسند، از خودباوری ملت ما می‌ترسند. بدانید ملت ایران از حق مسلم خود صرف نظر نخواهد کرد. بشنوید این صدای ملت ایران است که نظر خود را به صراحت نسبت به انرژی هسته‌ای اعلام می‌کند. بشنوید.
A few weeks later, Jack Straw played host to Condoleezza Rice in his constituency. The confrontation with Iran was pulling the US and the UK apart. For the first time since the invasion of Iraq, the UK was refusing to endorse American threats.
I was saying, hang on, you just need to understand that there aren't any circumstances in which this British government, or in my view, any British government, could be involved in military action against Iran.
Secretary of State, what next steps could be taken to persuade the Iranians to pull back from the uranium enrichment program? Jack Straw keeps telling us that military action will never be used.
First of all, the American president never takes any option off the table. You don't want the American president to take any option off the table. To respond to
my point, from a British perspective, was that since I thought that it would be completely inappropriate and counterproductive to take military action. And given the background of Iraq, I think we would have been involved in a political firestorm if I had given a hint that military action was a possibility. Now, I may say Tony Blair took a different view about that.
Within the month, Blair would remove Jack Straw from the Foreign Office. But he still had one last chance to exploit the special relationship.
At the end of the trip, Condi and I went to her plane.
Straw stayed on board. He flew with Rice on an unscheduled trip to Iraq.
On that trip, we spent quite a long time in her cabin talking about Iran. My message to Condi was this: we Europeans have gone as far as we can by ourselves, and frankly, so far as the Iranians are concerned, we Europeans are a sprat to catch a mackerel, and you're the big fish, the United States.
After changing planes in Kuwait, they arrived in the war zone. In the previous month, 1,000 Iraqis and 31 Americans had died there.
Sunnis and Shias were killing each other across the length and breadth of the country. The government of Iraq couldn't come together around a new prime minister, in part because Iran was deeply involved. We wanted to counter the Iranian pressure. All this was going on at the same time that journalists in the United States were writing that we were getting ready for war with Iran.
It was clear to me that she was anxious to find a way through this, and that she would, if she could, seek to get other principals than the president on board for direct involvement in talks with the Iranians.
Rice was about to attempt her most audacious move as Secretary of State. It was the Easter holidays. George and Laura Bush hosted an Easter egg hunt at the White House. But Condi Rice stayed home.
She asked her staff to give her a series of calendars for April and May and June, July. And she began to sketch out a diplomatic strategy that would get us to negotiations with the Iranians. She took that and had breakfast the next morning with President Bush and received the president's permission to go ahead.
یه عصری بود سفارت سوئیس این طرح رو آورد به ما داد. البته قبلش ما گفته بودن ایشون کار خیلی مهمی میخواد انجام بده.
The Secretary of State would make an announcement later that day. Iran's negotiator was given the text.
We are agreed with our European partners on the essential elements of a package containing both benefits if Iran makes the right choice and costs if it does not.
همون موقعی که طرح ما رسید ما جلسه داشتیم طرح داشتیم میخوندیم این کشورهای مختلف رو بسیج کردن تماس بگیرید هی این شیوخ محله و اینا هی زنگ میزدن که این یک شانس بزرگه خواهش میکنیم زود رد نکنید.
As soon as Iran fully and verifiably suspends its enrichment and reprocessing activities, the United States will come to the table with our EU colleagues and meet with Iran's representatives.
For the first time in almost 3 decades, the US was offering to speak directly with Iran. Regime change was out.
That policy had failed. We had tried advocated regime change. We had a very threatening posture towards Iran for a number of years. It didn't produce any movement whatsoever.
The Americans made it possible to offer the Iranians more than any of them had thought conceivable. From civil nuclear power stations to the biggest prize of all, welcoming the Islamic Republic into the family of nations.
Secretary Rice and I were quite buoyant. We felt that the Iranians were going to accept this offer.
The offer was presented to Iran's negotiator by the EU's foreign policy chief.
I tried to be as constructive as possible, as friendly as possible to him, as respectful as possible to his country.
آقای سولانا خب توضیح دادن بسته رو از روی متنی که داشتن و بعدم گفتن من خصوصی میخوام با شما صحبت.
They went into a side room with a translator.
I went into some of the details that we prefer not to be said in the formal meeting.
آقای سولان در خصوصی گفت که این فرصت خوبی است مثلا مذاکره کنیم. گفتم خب ما میفهمیم حالا فرصت خوب بعدش ولی حالا چی توی این هست تعلیق و اینا که میدونیم ما نمیپذیریم. اینجوری گفت نه اون تحقیق و اینا هست. حالا خصوصی به ما اینو گفت.
Centrifuges for research were what Jack Straw had turned down 2 years earlier. This was a big concession to Iran.
He said, whatever proposal you make to me here, I will have to discuss it with other people in the structure of power of Tehran. And as you know, the structure of power of Tehran is not a simple matter.
چون در کشور ما به هر حال رهبری است و تصمیم نهایی رو میگیره این دیدگاه باید مطرح بشه. بعضی‌ها میگفتن این باز یک دامه یه فریبه. موقف یه عده بود که این فرصت خیلی طلایی.
President Ahmadinejad was against the proposal. Larijani was in favor. But when he came to Brussels 6 weeks later, all he could do was turn on the charm.
Yes was not there, no was not there. Yes but, no but, it was full of that. And in Farsi it's much easier to do that. In English it's more difficult.
A month later they met again. There now seemed to be enough support in the National Security Council for Larijani to take a half step forward.
موضوعی که ما داشتیم که علل اغلب این بود که ما این دو حالت افراط تفرید رو قبول نداریم. طرح لازم نیست همه چیزش کامل باشه و درست باشه. میتونه 30%، 40% درست باشه. طرف مقابل فقط ظرفیت این باید داشته باشه که اگر اشکالات بهش گفتن تکمیل کنه.
Larijani and Solana hatched a plan to open talks in New York during the UN General Assembly. The New York meeting was to be carefully choreographed. Iran would temporarily suspend enrichment, and the West would suspend sanctions. The key was that the two sides would make these concessions at the same time.
Rafsanjani would come to New York, to the Waldorf Astoria. He would meet with the European foreign ministers and the Russians and Chinese foreign ministers. He would accept the basis of negotiations, and at that point Secretary Rice could then enter the room, have dinner with them, sit down across from them, and have the very first conversation.
تو دیپلماسی 10% ظرفیت هم روش کار میکنن، دور نمیریزن.
Dr. Rafsanjani was very enthusiastic about that meeting with the permanent members of the Security Council, and to do that in New York at the time of the General Assembly was not a minor thing.
New York would give Rafsanjani the chance to win the argument in Iran. He'd get rid of hated sanctions. Receiving the public respect of world leaders would show that Iran was no longer a pariah state. The Americans were ready.
We had formed a negotiating team. We'd done all sorts of research on how best to work with them. We'd thought through the various elements of what we would do and the pace of the negotiations. We were quite looking forward to it.
We're working toward a diplomatic solution to this crisis. And as we do, we look to the day when you can live in freedom, and America and Iran can be good friends and close partners in the cause of peace.
The Iranians were due at the UN on Monday. The Friday before, the State Department got a message. Rafsanjani would have minders.
The Iranians sent word to us that they had to have a delegation of nearly 300 people accompany Rafsanjani. None of them had visas. And Condi said to me, let's take away any excuse they have not to come. So I called our embassy in Bern in Switzerland and I said, could you please stay open throughout the entire weekend, issue several hundred visas, which they did.
All the technical questions were resolved. The visas were there, the travel arrangements were done.
I have the honor to welcome to the United Nations His Excellency Mr. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad.
The Iranian who arrived in New York and who was the center of attention at the United Nations was not the nuclear negotiator.
The President will have a press conference on Thursday.
It seemed President Ahmadinejad had won the argument in Iran.
Once President Ahmadinejad showed up in New York, it was clear that two were too many.
The plane never took off. Rafsanjani never took off from Tehran. He never made the trip. Those 300 people didn't get on the airplane. They never showed up in New York. And we were in New York thinking, well, maybe he'll come tomorrow, or the next day, or next week.
Rafsanjani was replaced by a much more hard-line negotiator, and Iran went ahead with its nuclear program. The West imposed more sanctions. 30 years ago, Iran's revolution promised freedom from Western interference. But the Islamic Republic ended up also rejecting liberalism and secularism, the principles that govern Western society. The many dead on both sides have reinforced this bitter divide. It will be difficult for any new leader to shift the weight of history.
We will extend a hand if you are willing to unclench your